Sir Kannan Gopalakrishnan. He was working as a senior architect at Engineering Design Research Centre, L&T Construction, India's largest construction company. He's also worked on projects ranging from institutional buildings to international airports, apartment complexes to aircraft hangars. He's also attended 3 international conferences and 2 national conferences, and has also presented technical papers at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi, and the MSRIT, Bangalore. He's also won the national championship at Archaman at the India's largest architecture quiz. Sir Kannan Gopalakrishnan currently runs a design firm, Habitat Design Studio, and he is also a visiting faculty at the renowned architecture schools in Tamil Nadu.
Welcome back to UGC lecture series. This is AR 6502 History of Architecture and Culture 5. We are in Unit 1, in the last leg of Unit 1, leading to a new architecture. This is lecture number 11, and if you remember the previous lecture, we saw different international expositions that shaped the future of architecture, and we also saw how exhibition spaces evolved over time, and we saw how cross-cultural influences and learning happened during these expositions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Today, we are going to have a look at one of the very important styles of architecture, which people call the Chicago School of Architecture. And this Chicago School of Architecture is very important because this is the reason why we have skyscrapers today. We have Burj Khalifa today, which is the world's tallest building. It stands over 600 meters tall in height, and people are planning to build a kilometer tall buildings right now. And all these are possible only because of the rise of skyscrapers, which happened right after Chicago School. So that is the importance of the school. So I am just telling you before we start on, so that you will understand the importance while you are studying it. So let's take a look at what Chicago School looked like. And before that, I am going to show you one picture. Just take a look at this picture and guess what happened here. There was a great fire in Chicago. This was a picture taken at the most prominent place, the junction of State and Madison Street, right after Chicago fire. If you look at the buildings, they are all nothing but plain rubble. Nothing could be used. There is nothing but rubble for kilometers together. This is a very sad thing to happen to a city, but from every ash there arises a new beginning. Every end is a beginning of a new tomorrow. So this fire was the reason why entirely Chicago city was completely redesigned and rebuilt from where it stood. From here, Chicago became like this when they conducted the expo. I am going to show you a series of buildings here, and in 1882 Montauk building was designed. This was one of the first buildings that had a large number of floors. It is a G+9 building. It had a main entrance arch and it had a frieze on the top. Again, it was a steel structure. The skeleton was made of steel. This is the auditorium building, which was designed in 1889. Take a look at the complex sections that they were able to develop at that particular point of time. And in this auditorium, you can see all the complex structures and complex systems that emerges out of this auditorium. And from looks, it looks like a very grand auditorium, but look at the amount of spaces that go behind the auditorium so that the auditorium can function properly. This is the hall, and to make this hall function, you need whole amount of spaces to make this thing work. That is how architecture works. For one space to function, you need so many other functions, para functions, which make this one function happen. This is one of the famous buildings called Chicago Stock Exchange Building. This was designed in 1894. Here, if you take a closer look, note the windows and the space between the windows. I will tell you what it is in the upcoming slides. And the entrance of this building was designed in an arch-like fashion, like how traditional classical entrances were usually designed. If you saw in the previous picture, During the fire, we were talking about buses that were pulled by horses in the industrial era. This was the late industrial era where buses are being pulled by horses. Here also you can see a bus being pulled by horses. And after the fire, if you look at the pictures of these buildings, here you can actually see motorized cars that travel through the city. So between these 20 years, look at how Chicago has developed so much. This is another famous building which is called the Home Insurance Building. This was also called the first modern skyscraper because of its huge height, at the same time the ingenuity of the architects to have designed such huge building with such huge openings. Then we have another famous building called the Wainwright Building. This is actually not in Chicago. It follows Chicago School of Architecture, but it's actually in Buffalo, New York. This is the Wainwright Building. Look at the complex decoration motifs that this building has, but the decoration is only limited to very small areas like these and the frieze on top. This is the most beautiful building, most predominant building in Chicago School of Architecture. In 1899, Carson, Pirie and Scott & Co. was established, and this is how the building looks. Here again, you can see that the horse-drawn carts are replaced with trams, and you can also see some cars moving along. Now you can clearly see the development that has happened so far. This is the entrance to the Carson, Pirie, Scott building. The entrance happens on the junction between the Madison and State, the same place where we saw the picture of the burnt Chicago. This is the same junction that was designed in after 20 years. This was a departmental store, a shopping mall building. This is another very interesting building. It's called the Chicago Building. This was built in 1904-05, and here again it's interesting to note the windows and the space between the windows. I'm going to explain that in a while. Let's talk about how Chicago School of Buildings barely started. See, this is the kind of buildings that started the Chicago School of Movement. These are the kind of buildings. This is the Carson, Pirie and Scott building, and this is just an extended version of this building. If you compare these two buildings, you can clearly say that this is like a big brother to this building. So what are the key characters here? Let's take a look at what is happening over here. If you see the base, this is white, it has classical columns, and it looks very, very antique. And there is another level over here which follows the same language, and there is another thing over here which follows the same language. Each has 3 floors each, but still these 3 floors have the same language and these 3 floors have the same language. And the top floor has its own language, and there is a big wide parapet and a frieze on top of it. If you take a classical column, there are always 3 parts to a column. There is a base, there is a shaft, and then there is a capital. The similar concept is taken in Chicago School of Architecture, and then what they have done is they thought that the building also should have 3 main parts: the base, the shaft and the column, called the capital. So in this building, if you see, this is the base, the white part is the base, this 6 floors over here is the shaft of the column, and the final floor and the top is the capital. So if you transfer the same to the big brother, this is your base, not as elaborate as this, but a little more simplified version of that, and this is the shaft, little longer than that shaft, but yes, shaft, and finally the capital with the top story. The skyscraper or the high-rise building was facilitated by the introduction of the electric elevator, which was invented at that particular point of time, and the sudden abundance of steel production in the country. So that was the reason why skyscrapers started to develop. Let's take a look at a few prominent architects who were key proponents of Chicago School of Architecture. They were Henry Hobson Richardson, Dankmar Adler, Daniel Burnham, William Hollabird, William LeBaron Jenney, Martin Roche, John Root, Solon Beman and Louis Sullivan. Here if you see, Adler and Sullivan were together, they were partners in an architecture firm, Burnham and Root were partners. Hollaber and Roche were partners. Let's take a look at some of the key characters of the Chicago School of Architecture. What gives out that this building belongs to Chicago School? So, the main distinguishing features are the use of steel frame with masonry cladding, usually it is terracotta. So, they built the buildings with a steel frame like a cage, and then in between the steel frames, wherever they were space, they cladded it with terracotta or masonry. In the masonry, they allowed large plate glass window areas, because if you allow large plate glass window areas, there are many advantages. One primary advantage is it reduces the load of the building, because you do not have to build it, you just have to leave open and add a glass window to it. So, the load decreases, number one. Number two is the view to the exterior of the building increases. Number three, you get large amount of light inside the building. Number four, you can use that space to display your products to the exterior, to the crowd below. So, if you keep a product right next to the window, people can see through the window to the product, and then when they see the product, they will get inspired to buy it. So, that was another famous character of this school of architecture, and that is one of the reasons why the school of architecture is Chicago School of Architecture is also called the commercial style. They also limited the amount of exterior ornamentation. For obvious reasons, they thought that ornamentation was a thing of the past, and then ornamentation is not a necessary thing anymore. What was necessary was to build taller buildings, get better visibility, to gain more people to look at your product and buy your product. Those were the important things back then, and the ornamentation was dwindling. The three parts of a classical column was used in the construction of buildings, like I explained before: the base, the shaft, and the capital. The use of Chicago window. I'll explain what Chicago window is in a bit. Let's take a look at some of the most famous buildings that were designed in this particular period of time, which belong to Chicago School of Architecture. We saw some of these buildings in the earlier slides, and some of these buildings are a little new. The Auditorium Building, the Sullivan Center, the Reliance Building, Gage Group Buildings, the Chicago Building, Brooks Building, Fisher Building, Hayworth Building, Leiter 1, Leiter 2, Market Building, Monadnock Building, Montauk Building, Rookery Building. These were some of the famous buildings that were in Chicago that followed Chicago School of Architecture, but there were also buildings which were outside Chicago which also followed Chicago School of Architecture. One or two buildings were even in Melbourne followed Chicago School of Architecture. So, yes, like I promised, I'll tell you what Chicago window is about. Chicago window is a typical three-part window, wherein the first part is this, second part, and the third part. The second part is usually a large fixed glass window, which means it allows only for light from the exterior. Also, you can display some of your products on the interior so that people can look at it. These two parts are similar and smaller than the main central part, but they are sash windows. Sash windows are windows that open from bottom. So, you open the window like this, like a bus window or something. You don't open the window like this or on horizontal manner. You open the window from bottom to top like a bus. So, the sash windows with central large open fixed glass with sash windows on either sides was the famous Chicago window. Sometimes this window is also placed in a little projected way, in which there was a small trapezoid bay which was created, and then the window was placed over the bay. That was also another famous way of doing a Chicago window. The Chicago architect Louis Sullivan gave a new expressive form to urban commercial buildings. Wainwright Building, which he designed in 1890-91 in St. Louis, Missouri. The Guarantee Building, which is in Buffalo, New York, which he designed in 1895. The Carson Pirie Scott Department Store, which he designed in 1899 in Chicago. Like I said, Carson Pirie Scott is in Chicago, whereas the Guarantee Building is in New York, and the Wainwright building is in St. Louis. So, the Chicago School of Architecture doesn't necessarily have to be in Chicago itself. Let's take a look at Carson Pirie Scott building in detail. This was a landmark departmental store building in State and Madison Streets, Chicago, Illinois, designed by Louis Sullivan, famous architect. Louis Sullivan was the person whom we attribute this famous saying to. When we say form follows function, this was actually said by Louis Sullivan. He said form ever follows function. So, that was the most famous word which is even now being followed in most of the architectural schools, being taught in a lot of architecture schools, and that famous saying is attributed to Louis Sullivan. And the famous Pritzker Architecture Prize, like the Nobel Prize of Architecture, also has Louis Sullivan's engraving on the back side, on the reverse side of the medal, along with the Vitruvian words of Utilitas formitas and Venestas, commodity, firmness and delight. So, I just told this to tell you about, to inform you about the fame of Louis Sullivan. The building is, Carson Pirie Scott building is remarkable for its steel structure, which allowed dramatic increase in window area. It has steel structure and, like I said, steel network, and all the space between the steel columns and beams is your window space. So, it had a dramatic increase in window area, which in turn allowed for more daylight into the building interiors and far more display of merchandise to the outside pedestrian traffic. So, the lavish cast iron ornamental work which is done in the rounded tower in the bottom portion, which in the entrance, was also meant to be a functional thing, not just an ornamental motif. This is what we are talking about, the entrance, which has a tremendous ornamentation detail, which is also designed as a functional element to make sure it looks outside. Sullivan designed the corner entry to be seen from both State and Madison, and that the ornamentation situated above the main entrance would be literally attractive. The building is one of the classic structures of Chicago School. The State and Madison are the two very important roads in Chicago, and when this building is situated in the corner of the building, corner of the streets, Sullivan could have made the entry from either of the sides, either from the Madison or the State, but he did not do that. He made the entrance right at the corner of both the streets, and he made sure that people passing through Madison or the State, both people can have a look at the entrance and they can take a look at the building. So, look at the genius of the building. Look at now you can realize why Chicago School of Architecture is also called the commercial style. This is the plan of the building. Very straightforward building, where you can see staircases wherever necessary, 1, 2, 3, and huge space for display of all your things, toilets on one corner, and the entrance. These are the two roads, Madison and State here, and along these two roads is the corner thing which he had designed. Let's take a quick look at another famous building called the Wainwright building. This is a 10-story red brick landmark office building in downtown Missouri, again designed by Adler and Sullivan. Sullivan used a steel frame again and an intricate terracotta ornament vertical bands to emphasize the height of the building. It is only a 10-storied building. It's not a very tall building, but still Sullivan was able to make the building look very tall, and this was a speciality of this building. Sullivan, even though the building was only a 10-story building, he made sure that the building should show the verticality. So, what he did was, even in the little spaces that he could find, he made vertical structures and he made intricate terracotta ornaments which form vertical bands, so that the verticality can be expressed in every single thing. Aesthetically, the Wainwright building exemplifies Sullivan's theory about tall buildings, which included the tripartite composition. Tripartite is the column, shaft and the beam composition which I was talking about earlier. Tripartite composition based on the structure of the classical column. His desire to emphasize the height of the building. This is the plan of the building, which is very straightforward. Corridors right in the middle and offices along the windows. Sullivan used to write that the skyscraper must be tall, every inch of it tall. The force and the power of altitude must be in the glory and pride of exaltation. must be in it. It says that the verticality, the power of altitude must be in its glory. Pride of exaltation must be in the verticality. Every inch should be proud and a soaring thing, rising in sheer exaltation, that from bottom to top it is one single unit without a single dissenting line. Despite the classical column concept, the building design was deliberately modern, featuring none of the neoclassical style elements which Sullivan thought. This is that inside courtyard of the building, which you can see over here. This is this space. These are some of the sketches which the architects made. And if you take the interiors of the space, it looks like this: a double-story building with a lot of light washing into the room. Even in the interiors, look at the amount of daylight which the building can bring. The ornamentation for the building includes a wide frieze below the deep cornice, which expresses the formalized yet naturalistic celery leaf foliage typical of Sullivan, and published in a system of architectural ornament, decorated spandrels between the windows on the different floors, and an elaborate door surrounded at the main entrance. Apart from the slender big piers, the only solids of the wall surface are the spandrel panels and between the windows. So those are the places where he needs to have certain ornamentation of the building. So ornamentation is not a necessity of the building, it is just that when there is solid space of the wall, so why not ornament it to make it look attractive. Even the ornamentation must have a meaning according to Sullivan. In here the meaning is to attract people, to make them look at the building in such a way that when they look at the building, they look at the products which are displayed in the building, and then the economics goes up. So even the ornamentation detail is a result of economics. If you take a look at the Wainwright building, and if you started analyzing with respect to principles of architecture, this is the structure of the building. And if you take a plan and if you take a section, this is the plan and this is the section of the building. So you can see how they are comparable. If you see the circulation, which is in white color, and the usage places in dark color, you can clearly see that there is very minimal circulation and a lot of usage spaces which happen. And you can see that the elevation geometry, the rectangle and the diagonal geometry, can be reflected in the plan elements as well. Even in the planning, the same kind of geometry still exists. Even in the miniature versions of the rectangle, still the geometry exists. And he tried to use the additive and subtractive forms here, a small additive form over here and a subtractive form over here, which gives a twist to the building. If you take a section of the building and he gets in natural light from the outside on the courtyard and almost all levels, so the building is bathed with natural light at all times. If you take a look at massing, look at one huge building and with a slight cornice on the top, which gives it its classical look. Compare the two different units to the whole. These are two rectangle units with another rectangle here. Together forms the whole building. If you look at the geometry and balance, it's almost symmetrical along this axis, similar to this. If you take a look at repetitive forms, so it keeps the windows keep repeating. And if you take a look at the vertical bands, there is a hierarchy of vertical bands here. Similarly, you can keep counting n number of architectural principles that can be derived from this one single building. This is an architecture book in itself, this building. That is why, ladies and gentlemen, Louis Sullivan is one of the most famous architects and the most important architects to study about in your architecture career. Taking a closer look at the architectural motif, the decorative motif that he had designed, this is that decorative motif, and if you see that there is the motifs are being manufactured in different things, but still there is a continuity that keeps them going. And this is the actual color of the motif in terracotta. This is how it looks. The Wainwright building is considered to be the first skyscraper to forego the normal ornamentation which is used on skyscraper at that particular point of time. They use different kind of ornamentation to bring in crowd, boost economics of the space. Some of the architectural elements of the building have been removed in renovations, and they've taken to the building St. Louis Building Arts Foundation. Now it's time to take a look at what we learned in this episode. We learned that the Chicago style of architecture and the importance of the style in the history of architecture itself. We saw the rise of modern skyscrapers from the bare beginnings of the Chicago School of Architecture. We also saw the use of functional aesthetics and the importance of economics in architecture, the reason why the style is also called as commercial style. With this, we should be able to answer the following questions that are going to appear on the screen right now. Explain the reasons why the skyscraper movement had to begin in Chicago of all places. Why not London, Paris or New York? Explain the link between classical antiquity and the design of early skyscrapers and how they took inspiration from the classical antiquity. Explain the life and works of Louis Sullivan with relevant quotes and sketches. With this, we come to an end of Unit 1. In Unit 1, we saw a variety of styles of architecture. We saw ranging from neoclassical architecture to industrial architecture to Chicago School of Architecture and the rise of skyscrapers. We are yet to see a lot of interesting architecture and other information in the forthcoming units. So until then, thank you.
Bye.